Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I created these two cards. Now, the difference between the two cards is one of them I used a 2D embossing folder and one I used a 3D embossing folder. Now, a 2D embossing folder only has high levels and low levels, where a 3D has some points in between. So the first step to create the backgrounds is I'm using glossy cardstock, and I'm creating a traditional distress background on that glossy cardstock using distress oxides. I do have a shorts video on here that shows this a little bit slower. I sped it up for this just because it's very, very repetitive. The way to do these backgrounds is squish the oxide inks on your mat, put some water on them, and then dip your glossy cardstock in there using a heated tool to dry in between different dips. I usually do about 3 or 4 times to create this background. Now I'm going to do the 2D embossing folder first. I use a Big Shot machine to do this, and I have my multi-purpose platform with the top tab open. I have a plate beneath my embossing folder and one on top of my embossing folder, and that's the perfect sandwich for that machine. If you don't happen to have a Big Shot machine, use whatever sandwich your machine company recommends for an embossing folder. So after I've put my piece through the embossing folder, I'm going to take some Distress Micro Glaze, and I'm going to use an applicator tool and just put it on the top part of my background. What this is going to do is it's going to remove the oxidization from the oxide ink, and it's going to reveal the glossy cardstock with the dye ink that has seeped in. And it's just a different way of getting a different look out of oxide inks. You definitely have to use this with glossy cardstock. It won't work with regular cardstock. You get a completely different look that's totally different if you're just using regular cardstock. I like to use this applicator tool with a foam pad. It fits perfectly into the microglaze pot, and you can apply as much or as little as you want. Make sure as you're rubbing the glaze off with your paper towel that you move to a clean area every single time. If you're just using a dirty area of it, you're just going to start reapplying that ink back on. And if you can see, the background or the lower parts of this background still have the matte finish from the oxide ink, but the raised parts have the gloss finish from the glossy cardstock. So it's just a different way of getting a different effect out of your backgrounds, and I really enjoy using these with embossing folders. Some will work better than others. I have another video on here that I recently created doing the same technique but with a roses folder, so you get a completely different look. Now I'm going to do the background with a 3D folder. So once again, I have my oxide inks on my mat there. I've pressed them in, added some water, and in between different layers, I use my heated tool to dry it. Now I do at the end use an embossing tool because there are some areas that are so thick with ink that they just don't want to dry with the heated tool. And the embossing tool is a little bit more intense and direct, so it works really well to help those areas to completely dry. And that is what the background looks like before I put it through my 3D folder. So a 3D folder, I like to mist each side of my cardstock a couple times just to help to make those paper fibers a little bit more flexible. I'm putting it in the folder. Now my multi-purpose flat platform is in the same position it was with the 2D folder, and the difference when we're running this through is we're going to use only one cutting plate. So I remove the one below it and I just have one on top of it. If you look at these two folders here, you can see that the 3D one, which is the gray one, is a lot thicker. So by removing that cutting plate, we've allowed room in the sandwich for that 3D folder. I'm going to do the same technique for using the embossing glaze or the micro glaze on top of the embossed background here. I usually do about 1/4 of a sheet, and then I use my paper towel to buff it off. I don't do the whole thing just because you want to have some area to hold on to without having that micro glaze on there. You'll see that I ripped my background there between the bricks, but it's going to not matter. I'll still be able to use it in my card. You'll never even know that it was there. As you're doing this, I like to use a lighter hand to start to get a feel for how much is being taken off. And then after a while, I'll do a little bit heavier hand with rubbing with the microglaze. You can keep going and do more and more until you have the look that you want with this. But it's always best to do a light hand first and then go further. So the piece on the left is the 3D piece, and the piece on the right is from the 2D embossing folder. And I hope you can see in the video how much difference there is with the texture. So for the focal point of my card, I'm going to use these birds here. They're just created with a background that I created using some of the excess ink for distress backgrounds, and I have another shorts video on here that shows how I made them. I just like to not waste the ink that I have when I'm creating the distress background, so I'll often take an excess piece and just dip it in the ink. Because there's less ink on there, you'll get less coverage and a little bit more open space, but it's a great way to create some custom embellishments for your cards or paper crafting projects. Now I like to use Distress Collage medium for gluing my cards together. A liquid glue helps you to move things and shimmy things in place, and the Distress Collage medium it dries completely clear and it dries matte, so if anything happens to seep out, you're not going to be able to see that it was there. When you're gluing down a 3D folder, because there's so much more texture, you want to make sure to put glue on the part of that that embossed background that is going to touch your card base. And I like to put an acrylic block on top of there just to hold it into place and make sure that those areas have contact while it's drying. You don't have to be quite as careful with just a 2D background because there's not as much texture, and not the raised and lower areas are not as different as done with a 3D folder. But I still do like to put an acrylic block down to hold everything down while I'm gluing it. I'm just going to, while those backgrounds are being glued to the cards, I'm just going to take a moment to glue some of the pieces that are for the front of the cards. I've got all this stuff pre-die cut. If you haven't used a Big Shot machine, or if you're new to a Big Shot machine, I have a whole playlist on here that is Big Shot for beginners. And it goes through the different ways to use a Big Shot machine, using steel rule dies, using wafer dies, using embossing folders, and that sort of thing. So if it's new to you, you'll find a lot of information on that playlist. I'm taking a branch here from my branch and florals die, and I'm gluing it down, and then I'm going to glue one of the bird die cuts on top of it. Before I glue that bird die cut on top of there, I want to use an blending brush and just ink some of the edges just to get a little bit more detail out of that die cut. I'm going to do those the branch and the little strip across the card for the second card. Might as well use up my time while I'm waiting for those backgrounds to dry. I might as well get those pieces and die cuts glued together and ready to go. Now, before I forget, all of the supplies that I'm using, including the ink colors and whatnot, are listed in the description box below. So if there's anything that I haven't mentioned, and I'm sure there probably is, you'll find that information down there. If there's something that I've missed, please leave a comment. I'm happy to answer questions. And if you find techniques like this interesting and helpful, please hit the subscribe button below. It lets YouTube know that that's the type of information that you're interested in and type of videos that you're interested in. It also lets me know that what I'm sharing is interesting and helpful to people. Now, while I'm waiting for these pieces to dry, I'm going to use my blending brushes and I'm going to ink those birds. And because my background is mostly blues is what came out of it, I'm using the purple color and pink. So the purple is Wilted Violet, the pink is Picked Raspberry, and these two colors were used with the Oxide version on my background. So there are bits of these colors in that background that are showing through. And I'm lightly using my blending brush just to blend some of the areas, just to get some of that ink around the edges. Now I do like to use the blending brush for this because I have a little bit more control over how much ink goes down. If you were to use the pad directly onto your die cut, you would have less control and it would go where it goes. But by using the blending brush, if I don't have as much ink as I want the first time, I can always go back and add a little bit more. Always best to start with a lighter amount and then add more if you want it. Now at this point, I forgot which bird went with which, and it really doesn't matter because they're basically the same card with just a little bit of different orientation. I typically like to do more than one card at a time just because it really doesn't take a whole lot more time, but better to have two finished pieces than one with a little bit of extra or not much extra time put in. So I'm gluing those pieces down to the 2D piece first, just because I know that that background is likely glued down to the card already. Now I'm going to glue those pieces down to the 3D background. Now I'm only gluing the strip on the front of the card plus the bird. I have some flowers that I want to put on that branch there, but I want to wait until this strip and the bird is glued down and is stuck before I add those pieces to it. And I also want to use some of the pink ink and ink in the center of those flowers just to make them pop a little bit more. I didn't want to introduce any new colors from that background because that background is quite bright and quite vibrant and bold basically. So I didn't want to have different colors in there starting to compete with that. So I'm using the same colors to it. And for that reason, I haven't added any leaves to these branches. If I happen to have any green in the background, I probably would have, but I didn't want to add any more colors. And that's also why my branch is actually white. And I think it looks totally fine. It ties in with the white space that's in that background there. So these flower die cuts are really, really tiny. So I'm using a small blending brush just to add a little bit of pink in the center. Once they are all inked, I'm going to use a stylus and a soft mat and mold them just to give them a little bit of shape. Now, these are styluses and a mat from McGill. I've had them for many, many, many years. You could use just a mouse pad. That would absolutely work. And then just something with a rounded end, that would work as well. Styluses are one of those basic tools that do come in handy, but if you don't happen to have one, there's likely something around the house that you probably have that would work and do the same job. So the first part that I'm doing is putting the stylus in the center, and I'm just rolling it around. And by using this on a soft mat, it adds some curve to that die cut. Now, after doing this, I really wanted those flower petals to kind of bend back. They were just more of a cup than I liked. So I'm turning them over, blending them or rolling them with the stylus and then turning them back and putting that center divot back in there. You can see this happens really, really easily and really, really quickly. I would definitely make sure to ink your die cuts before doing this. After they've got the curve to them, it's going to be really difficult to get any shape into them. But it does happen really, really quickly. And the flowers just look slightly more natural with their shape once you've done this. Now that those are done, I can add them to the front of my card. Now, after these are done, because those die cuts have some shape to them, I can't put my acrylic block back down on them. Otherwise, I would flatten that shape that I just got in there. So that is why I wanted that strip of cardstock in the center, as well as my bird to be die cut down or glued down and firmly in place before doing this. Now I'm just adding a dot of my Distress Collage medium to the center of the die cut and placing them into place. You may find that it's a little bit easier to use a tweezers to hold these pieces. I tried doing that, but my tweezers had a little bit of glue on them, so they ended up sticking more to the die cut than anything. But by using a liquid glue, you have a little bit more freedom when you're moving or when you're putting your die cuts. If you don't like them exactly where you've put them, you can just shift them and shimmy them a little bit and get the movement or the placement that you want. The other thing that you'll want to do is once your flowers are in place, just leave them alone to dry. Because there's only a small area that is glued down here, and because we don't have an acrylic block holding everything in place, it's really easy to shift and move them. So you want to give that glue some time to set. This liquid glue, it doesn't really take long to set, so it's not like you're going to be waiting that long. And it's only a dot of glue, so because of the small amount, again, it's not going to take that long to set. But you don't want to start moving things around because your die cuts are likely going to be shifted and moved if you start playing around with it. Now the die set I used for them is not a new one. It's fairly old. It's listed down below. But what I like about it is it's got several different flower choices that you can choose from. And for each flower, there's 5 different sizes. So you can choose what size is going to work best for your card. And the other great thing is the sizes of them. They're nice and tiny. So it's a great way to use up scraps in your scrap bin. I love doing that with different die cuts just because some of those scrap pieces are so tiny that they're likely never going to be used. So this is a great way to use them up. Once that glue has set in the flowers, I am putting just a little dot of Stickles in the center of them. Stickles is a glitter glue that has a really, really fine tip, so you can get it in just small little areas. It's just going to add a little bit of sparkle to the center of that flower, but it's not going to add any color because the Stickles that I'm using is just iridescent glitter, so it's going to go well with these backgrounds and the colors. Now, typically when I'm using die cuts, if I do an animal that has an eye, I'll do black. But because there's no black in this card, I chose to do white for the eye, and I was actually pleased with how it ended up turning out. So this is the finished result of both of those cards, and it's probably harder to see on camera than it is in real life, the amount of different texture in the 3D folder. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great day.